The Texas sun bore down on the cracked earth like a judgment. Heat shimmered off the corrugated metal roof of the barn, distorting the horizon into a liquid mirage. Jack Mitchell stood in the shadow of the doorway, 78 years old and still standing straight as a fence post. His hands, weathered and scarred from decades of hard work, gripped a wrench with the kind of certainty that comes from a lifetime of fixing things that break. But some things, he knew, couldn't be fixed with tools. The ranch stretched out before him, 200 acres of stubborn Texas grassland that refused to surrender to the drought. Mesquite trees dotted the landscape like sentinels, their twisted branches reaching toward a sky that offered no mercy. 3 horses grazed near the water tank, their tails swishing against the relentless flies. This was his kingdom. This was his prison. Jack turned back to the tractor engine spread across his workbench. A 1967 Ford, older than most marriages, more reliable than most people. He'd bought it at auction 15 years ago for $500, and it had never let him down. The carburetor needed cleaning. Simple work. Honest work. The kind that didn't ask questions or expect answers. The morning stretched into afternoon the way it always did. No phone calls, no visitors, no interruptions. Just the way he liked it. Except today was different. The mail truck appeared at 2:15, exactly on schedule. Hector Ramirez had been delivering mail to this route for 12 years, and in all that time, Jack had spoken maybe 50 words to him. Hector knew better than to make small talk. He'd wave from the truck, Jack would nod from wherever he was working, and that was the extent of their relationship. But today, Hector got out of the truck. Jack watched him approach, holding a large envelope that required a signature. The kind of mail that meant something had changed, and change was the enemy of peace. Hector held out the electronic pad without meeting Jack's eyes. They both knew the rules. Sign, nod, done. Jack scrawled his name, took the envelope, and Hector retreated to his truck like a man escaping a crime scene. The dust cloud from his departure hung in the air long after the sound of the engine faded. The envelope was heavy, official. Return address from a law firm in Washington, D.C., Pemberton, Chase & Associates. Jack turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the way a man might hold a live grenade. He could throw it away, burn it in the fire pit, pretend it never arrived. But he didn't. Inside the house, the air conditioning hummed its mechanical lullaby. The living room was sparse, a worn leather couch, a coffee table with water rings from years of neglect, a television that hadn't been turned on in months. The walls were bare except for a single photograph in a cheap frame, a younger version of himself in dress uniform, standing next to a woman with kind eyes and a smile that had suggested she'd believed in something once. Sarah, his daughter. 52 years old now, living in Austin. They hadn't spoken in 10 years. Not since the funeral. Not since he'd made it clear that sympathy was worse than silence. Jack sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. The letter was printed on expensive paper with raised letterhead. Attorney speak. The kind of language designed to sound important while saying nothing at all. But 3 paragraphs in, the words stopped being noise and became a hammer. DNA match, military database, biological father identified. Jack read it 3 times, then 4. The words didn't change. Staff Sergeant Henry Coleman, service number 132-78941. Born June 14, 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Killed in action April 17, 1945, near Nuremberg, Germany. Posthumously awarded the Bronze Star with Valor. Tank Commander, 3rd Armored Division. Died 3 months before Jack was born. The room tilted. Jack gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white against the scarred wood. 78 years. 78 years believing one truth, and now, with a single letter, that truth was revealed as a lie. The man who raised him, Tom Mitchell, rough-handed, hard-drinking. Tom Mitchell, who'd made it clear that affection was a weakness and expectations were a burden. That man wasn't his father, had never been his father. And his mother, Mary Coleman Mitchell, dead 20 years now, buried with her secrets intact. She'd known. Every day of Jack's life, she'd known, and she'd never said a word. The rage came first, hot and immediate. Then it cooled into something harder. Something that felt like betrayal wrapped in 78 years of wasted wondering why he'd never been good enough for the man who'd raised him. Because he wasn't his son. Jack stood and paced the small kitchen. 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. The letter mentioned an attorney, a Mr. David Brennan, son of someone who'd served with Henry Coleman. There were materials, an inheritance, papers to sign. He should throw it away. He should burn the whole damn envelope and go back to his tractor and his horses and his carefully constructed isolation. But he didn't. Instead, he picked up the phone. The old landline, not the cell phone he kept charged but rarely used. He dialed the number on the letterhead. A receptionist answered, professional and distant. She transferred him to Mr. Brennan. The voice on the other end was older, seasoned, the kind of voice that had delivered bad news often enough to know how to make it sound almost gentle. They spoke for 17 minutes. Brennan explained the DNA match through a military genealogy project, explained that his own father, Robert Brennan, had served as gunner in Henry Coleman's tank crew, explained that Robert had spent decades trying to find Coleman's son, had left instructions in his will, had set aside a small trust for this exact moment. Jack listened without interrupting. When Brennan finished, there was a long silence on the line. Finally, Jack spoke. His voice was rough, unused to conversation. What exactly did your father leave? Papers, Brennan said. Letters, a journal, some personal effects, and information. About the last mission, about what happened to your father. I know what happened. He died in the war. Yes, Brennan said carefully. But there's more to it than that. Things your father wanted passed on. Things he made my father promise to deliver if his son was ever found. Another silence. Jack could hear his own breathing, slow and deliberate. Mr. Mitchell, Brennan said, I know this is overwhelming, but your father was a remarkable man. What he did in those final days, it matters. And I think you deserve to know the whole story. Jack closed his eyes. 78 years old and suddenly orphaned all over again. 78 years old and being handed a father he'd never known, wrapped in a mystery he'd never asked for. When can I come to Washington? Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow. Jack hung up without saying goodbye. He stood in his kitchen as the afternoon light slanted through the window, painting everything in shades of amber and regret. Outside, the horses grazed, oblivious. The tractor waited, patient as always. The ranch would survive a few days without him. He hadn't left this property for more than a day trip in 5 years, hadn't been on an airplane in 15. The thought of Washington, D.C., of cities and crowds and noise, made his chest tight. But he was going. He pulled down the small suitcase from the top of his closet. It was covered in dust. Inside, his dress uniform was still there, pressed and preserved in plastic from the last time he'd worn it. A funeral, his wife's funeral. Rebecca. Gone 8 years now. Cancer. Quick and cruel. Jack didn't pack the uniform. He packed jeans and work shirts, practical clothes for a practical man. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, watching the blades cut through the darkness. His mind churned through 78 years of memories, trying to separate truth from fiction. Had his mother loved him? Had Tom Mitchell resented him? Had everyone known except him? At 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread out before him. Staff Sergeant Henry Coleman, Hank. The letter said his friends called him Hank. Jack tried to imagine him, a young man from Oklahoma, 23 years old when he died. Younger than Jack's own daughter was now. A kid, really. A kid commanding other kids in a metal box, playing a game where the stakes were life and death. Tank commander. Jack knew tanks. He'd spent 7 years in Germany during the Cold War, commanding an M60 Patton. The standoff years. The staring contest with the Soviets across the border. Training, exercises, war games that felt real enough to leave scars but never crossed the line into actual combat. He'd been good at it. Precise. Careful. His crew had respected him, maybe even liked him, though he'd kept them at a distance. When his enlistment was up, he'd walked away and never looked back. Came home to Texas, married Rebecca, bought the ranch, built a life that had nothing to do with war or weapons or the weight of command. But he'd never escaped the feeling that he was a fraud, a tank commander who never commanded in battle, a soldier who never fought. He'd trained for a war that never came, and part of him had always wondered if that made him lucky or cursed. Now he knew his father had done the real thing, had faced the real test, had died in the real fire. And Jack had spent his whole life running from a shadow he didn't even know was there. The flight to Washington left at 9:30. Jack arrived at Amarillo International Airport 2 hours early, something Rebecca used to tease him about. You could show up an hour before a flight and still make it with time to spare, she'd say. But Jack believed in margins, in preparation, in not leaving anything to chance. The airport was small and manageable. He checked his bag, went through security without incident, and sat at the gate watching families and business people bustle past. Everyone moving with purpose, everyone going somewhere that mattered to them. Jack wondered if any of them were carrying secrets that could detonate their entire understanding of who they were. The flight was uneventful. Jack had a window seat and spent 3 hours watching the country pass beneath him. The stark beauty of West Texas giving way to the patchwork farms of the Midwest, then the dense sprawl of the East Coast. From this height, everything looked orderly, contained, as if the chaos of individual lives could be organized into neat grids and straight lines. He knew better. Washington, D.C. hit him like a wall of humidity and noise. The airport was massive, crowded, overwhelming. Jack moved through it like a man underwater, following signs and instinct until he emerged into the ground transportation area. He'd arranged for a car service, a practical sedan with a quiet driver who understood that silence was sometimes the best conversation. The law office was in Georgetown, old money neighborhood, brick buildings with ivy and brass plaques, the kind of place where history pressed down on you with the weight of importance. Jack entered through glass doors into a lobby that smelled of furniture polish and ambition. The receptionist was young and efficient. She showed him to a conference room on the 3rd floor. Large windows overlooking the street, a mahogany table that could seat 12, and at the head of the table, a cardboard box. David Brennan entered a moment later. He was 65, maybe 67, silver hair, tailored suit, the kind of handshake that had been practiced into an art form. But his eyes were kind. That counted for something. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming." Jack nodded. Words felt unnecessary. Brennan gestured to the box. "This is everything my father left. He was meticulous about it. Kept it sealed, kept it safe. He died 5 years ago, but he'd been looking for you since the 1970s. The DNA databases finally gave us a breakthrough last month." Why? Jack's voice was rough. Why did it matter to him? Brennan pulled out a chair and sat. Jack remained standing. "My father was 20 years old when the war ended. He was the gunner in your father's tank. Sherman M4A3E8. They called it Iron Promise. He loved your father, Mr. Mitchell, as a commander, as a friend. And what happened in those final days? It changed him, made him promise to find you if he could, to tell you the truth." "What truth?" Brennan reached into the box and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing 3 leather-bound journals, a stack of letters tied with string, a set of dog tags, and a photograph. Jack moved closer. The photograph showed 5 men standing in front of a Sherman tank. Young faces, too young, smiling despite the mud and exhaustion visible in every line of their bodies. One of them, front and center, was clearly the commander. He stood with one hand on the tank's hull, the other on his hip, looking at the camera with an expression that was part confidence, part weariness. He looked like Jack. Same eyes, same jaw, same way of standing like the ground beneath him was his to defend. "That's Henry Coleman," Brennan said quietly. "Your father, front center. My father is on his right. That's Robert Brennan. The others were Thomas O'Reilly, driver, James Washington, loader, and Paul DeMarco, assistant driver." Jack picked up the photograph with hands that wanted to shake, but refused to give in. He studied every detail. The tank behind them, scarred and dented. The landscape, European countryside turned to mud. The way they stood together, a unit, a family of necessity and survival. Did any of them make it? My father did. Thomas O'Reilly did. The others died in the final engagement. Jack set down the photograph and picked up the dog tags. The metal was cool against his palm, stamped with his father's name and service number. The same numbers from the letter. "Tell me about the final engagement." Brennan reached into the box again and pulled out a hand-drawn map. It was surprisingly detailed, marked with coordinates and notes in careful handwriting. April 15th, 1945, near Nuremberg. The war was essentially over, but nobody had told the soldiers that. Your father's tank encountered a German Tiger I heavy tank, serial number 214, commanded by a 19-year-old officer named Werner Von Hassel. Jack looked up sharply. "Tiger I? You know the tank?" "I know their reputation." Brennan nodded. "Then you know what your father was facing. A Sherman against a Tiger was not an even match. But what happened next? That's the story." He pushed the journals across the table. Your father kept detailed records. The last entry was written the morning of April 15th. But there's more. My father wrote his own account. And after the war, he spent years researching what happened to the German crew, specifically to Werner von Hassel. Jack opened the first journal. The handwriting was neat, controlled. The entries were dated, organized, professional. But between the lines, you could feel the weight, the fear, the hope, the desperate attempt to make sense of chaos. He flipped to the final entry, April 15th, 1945. The words were simple, direct. We found the tiger today. Everyone says run, everyone says retreat, but I looked at that tank and I saw a kid inside, maybe younger than me, and I thought about Mary, about the baby coming, about what kind of world I want him to grow up in. A world where we run from each other, or a world where we face each other and remember we're all just scared kids in metal boxes. I made a choice. I don't know if it's the right one, but it's mine. If I don't make it home, someone needs to finish this. Someone needs to make this mean something. That was the last entry. Jack closed the journal carefully and looked at Brennan. What happened? They fought for 40 minutes, tank against tank, neither one firing the killing shot, maneuvering, positioning, waiting for the other to make a mistake, and then American artillery hit the area. Neither commander knew it was coming. Both tanks were disabled. The Tiger caught fire. Your father pulled Werner von Hassel from the burning tank, saved his life. But in doing so, he was hit by shrapnel from a secondary explosion. Brennan's voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath. The kind that comes from retelling a story you've lived with your whole life. My father held your father while he died. Your father's last words were about you, about the promise, about making it mean something. Jack stood very still. The conference room felt too small, too bright, too full of ghosts he'd never invited. The German, von Hassel, what happened to him? Brennan smiled. It was a small, sad smile. That's the remarkable part. Werner von Hassel survived the war. He went home to Bavaria, and he spent the next 50 years searching for that Sherman, searching for the wreckage, searching for the story. He wanted to rebuild both tanks, the Sherman and the Tiger, as monuments. Did he? He did. It took him decades, cost him everything he had, but he did it. And 3 months ago, he finished. Both tanks fully restored, Iron Promise and Tiger 214, side by side in his private museum. Brennan reached into the box one last time and pulled out a letter. Recent. The envelope was addressed in shaky handwriting. This arrived at my office 6 weeks ago. From Werner von Hassel himself. He's 98 years old now. Dying. He wanted me to find you. He wanted to meet the son of the man who saved his life. Jack took the letter but didn't open it. His hands were steady now. Something had settled inside him. A decision made without conscious thought. Where is he? Bavaria, Germany. He's too ill to travel. But he's waiting. He's been waiting for 79 years. Jack looked at the box, at the journals and letters and dog tags, at the photograph of 5 young men who'd believed they were invincible, at the map with its careful notations of a battle that had defined everything that came after. I need to go there. I thought you might say that. I took the liberty of researching flights. There's one tomorrow evening, direct to Munich. Jack nodded slowly. Tomorrow, always the next step before you finish the current one. But some things couldn't wait. He gathered the materials back into the box. Brennan helped him, handling everything with the reverence of a man who understood the weight of history. Mr. Mitchell, Brennan said as Jack prepared to leave, my father spoke about your father often. He said Hank Coleman was the best commander he ever served under. Not because he was fearless, but because he was afraid and did the right thing anyway. He said that's what courage actually looks like. Jack met his eyes. I spent 7 years as a tank commander. Never fired a shot in anger. Never faced a real enemy. I don't know if that makes me a coward or just lucky. My father would have said it makes you the beneficiary of your father's sacrifice. That's the point. They fought so you wouldn't have to. Jack carried the box out of the office, down the elevator, through the lobby and onto the Georgetown street. The afternoon sun was gentler here than in Texas, filtered through old trees and older buildings. He stood on the sidewalk, holding everything his father had left behind, and felt the full weight of a legacy he'd never asked for. That night, in a hotel room that smelled of industrial carpet and anonymous travelers, Jack opened the bundle of letters. 47 of them, all addressed to Mary Coleman, his mother, written in the months before he was born. He read them in chronological order, watched his father fall in love on paper, watched him dream about a future that would never arrive, watched him become more afraid and more hopeful with each passing page. The last letter was dated April 12, 1945, 5 days before he died. My dearest Mary, the war is ending. Everyone can feel it. The collapse is coming. But the closer we get to victory, the more dangerous it becomes. Desperate men do desperate things. If it's a boy, I want you to tell him about tanks, not the glory, not the heroism. Tell him tanks are just machines, steel and gears and armor, but the men inside them are brothers, no matter what flag they serve. Tell him courage is not the absence of fear. It's being afraid and choosing compassion anyway. Tell him I loved him before I ever met him. Tell him I would have been so proud. And tell him to finish what we started. Make this mean something. Make all of this death and sacrifice mean something. I love you. I love him. I will love you both until my last breath and beyond. Yours always, Hank. Jack folded the letter carefully and placed it back with the others. He sat in the dark hotel room, 78 years old, and cried for the first time since Rebecca died. Cried for the father he never knew. Cried for the mother who'd kept the secret. Cried for the man he might have been if he'd known the truth. But mostly he cried because he understood now. Understood why he'd always felt incomplete, why he'd pushed everyone away, why he'd built a life designed for solitude. He'd been carrying his father's ghost without knowing it, living in the shadow of a sacrifice he couldn't name. And now, finally, he had a chance to step into the light. In the morning, Jack made a phone call he should have made 10 years ago. He dialed a number he'd memorized but never used. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. Her voice was cautious. Hello? Sarah, it's me. Silence. Long enough that Jack thought she might hang up. Dad? Yeah, it's Dad. More silence. He could hear her breathing, could imagine her standing in her kitchen in Austin, trying to decide whether to be angry or afraid or something else entirely. I need to tell you something, Jack said, and then I need to ask you something. Okay. Her voice was careful, guarded. He'd earned that. The man who raised me wasn't my biological father. I just found out. My real father was a tank commander in World War II. He died before I was born. And there's a man in Germany who knew him, who was there when he died, who's been waiting 79 years to meet me. He could hear Sarah exhale, processing. I'm going to Germany, Jack continued, tomorrow. And I know I have no right to ask. I know I've been. I know I haven't been, but I'm asking anyway. Come with me. Dad, please, I don't want to do this alone, and I don't want to keep doing everything alone. I'm 78 years old, and I just found out my entire life was built on a lie, and I need my daughter. His voice broke on the last word. He hadn't meant for it to, but there it was, the truth, raw and undeniable. Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was softer. What time is the flight? Tomorrow evening, 7:45 from Austin. I'll meet you at the airport. I'll pay for everything. You just have to show up. I'll be there. Jack closed his eyes. Thank you. Dad, are you okay? He thought about that, really thought about it. I don't know, but maybe I will be. They talked for another 20 minutes. Awkward at first, then easier. She told him about her life, her divorce 2 years ago that he hadn't known about, her 2 kids, his grandchildren, who he barely knew, her job as a middle school teacher, her small house in South Austin. He told her about the ranch, about the horses, about the quiet. When they hung up, something had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but shifted. A crack in the wall he'd built. Jack spent the rest of the day preparing. He purchased a ticket for Sarah. He arranged for his neighbor to check on the horses. He packed his father's journals and letters into his carry-on, unable to let them out of his sight. That evening, he stood at his hotel window and looked out over Washington, D.C. The monuments were lit against the night sky, marble and stone, testifying to things people had decided mattered. Sacrifices, victories, moments when history pivoted on the choices of ordinary people. His father was buried somewhere in Europe, a military cemetery with rows of white crosses. Jack had never visited, hadn't known to visit, but now he would, after Germany, after meeting Werner Von Hassel, after understanding what had really happened on that April day in 1945. He would visit his father's grave and tell him he'd finished it, whatever it was, however he could. The promise would be kept. Jack turned from the window and looked at his reflection in the darkened glass. An old man, scarred by choices and silences, but still standing, still capable of one more mission. Tomorrow he would fly to Texas, board another plane with his daughter, cross an ocean to meet a dying man who'd been waiting longer than Jack had been alive. Tomorrow the ghost would finally speak, and Jack Mitchell, 78 years old and orphaned twice, would finally learn what it meant to be his father's son. The night deepened. The city hummed with its thousand small urgencies. And in a hotel room that had held 1,000 transient lives, Jack packed away his father's legacy and prepared to claim his own. The journey was just beginning, but for the first time in 78 years, he was ready. The Austin airport was smaller than Washington, more manageable, but Jack still arrived 2 hours early. Old habits die hard, and punctuality was one of the few things Tom Mitchell had beaten into him that actually served a purpose. He stood near the departure gate, watching travelers flow past like water around a stone, and wondered if Sarah would actually come. 10 years was a long time to hold silence, long enough for resentment to calcify into something harder than anger, long enough for a daughter to decide her father wasn't worth the effort anymore. He wouldn't blame her if she didn't show, but at 6:30, 45 minutes before boarding, she appeared. Jack saw her before she saw him, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow. She looked like Rebecca. Same dark hair, though streaked with gray now. Same way of carrying herself, shoulders back, chin up, like the world was something to face head-on rather than endure. 52 years old and beautiful in the way women become when they've survived things and decided survival wasn't enough. She was pulling a small, rolling suitcase, scanning the crowd, and when her eyes found him, they stopped. Neither of them moved. The airport bustled around them, announcements echoing, people rushing, life happening at its usual frantic pace. But in that moment, they were suspended. Then Sarah walked toward him, not running, not hesitant, just walking with purpose, the way she'd walked toward everything her whole life. They stood 3 feet apart. Jack wanted to hug her, but didn't know if he had the right. Sarah looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Assessment, maybe, or resignation. Finally, she spoke. "You look old." "I am old." "You look older than last time." "It's been 10 years. She nodded. "Yeah, it has." The silence stretched, but it wasn't hostile, just heavy with everything unsaid. "Thank you for coming," Jack managed. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "You sounded different on the phone, like you actually needed something." "That's new. I need a lot of things. I'm just figuring that out." She studied him for another moment, then nodded toward the gate. "We should probably check in." They did. The process was mechanical, familiar. Boarding passes scanned, bags tagged, security cleared. They moved through it together but separate, two people who'd forgotten how to share space. At the gate, they sat in adjacent chairs, not quite touching. Sarah broke the silence. "Tell me about him, your real father." Jack pulled out the photograph. The 5 young men standing in front of Iron Promise. He handed it to Sarah without comment. She studied it carefully, and Jack watched her face transform as she recognized the resemblance. "Oh my God, Dad, you look exactly like him." "I know. Grandma Mary never said anything?" "Not once." Sarah handed back the photograph, her fingers lingering on the edge. "That must have hurt, finding out that way." "It explains some things, like why Tom Mitchell was such a bastard to you." Jack looked at her sharply. She'd never said it out loud before, though they'd both known it. Tom Mitchell's particular brand of cruelty, the way he treated Jack like a disappointment from birth, the casual violence wrapped in discipline. "Yeah," Jack said quietly, "like that." The flight attendant called for boarding. They stood, gathered their things, and joined the queue. The plane was a Boeing 787 configured for the long haul across the Atlantic. Their seats were together in economy, window, and middle. Jack took the window, Sarah the middle. The aisle seat remained empty until the last moment when a businessman in an expensive suit claimed it and immediately plugged in noise-canceling headphones. The plane pushed back from the gate at 7:45 exactly. Jack watched Austin fall away beneath them, the lights spreading out like a circuit board, then giving way to the darkness of the Gulf. 9 hours to Munich, 9 hours suspended between one life and another. Sarah ordered wine when the drink cart came. Jack got coffee, black. They sat in silence while the plane climbed to cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed. Other passengers settled into sleep or entertainment, but Jack couldn't relax. Too many thoughts. Too many questions. "Tell me about the letter," Sarah said. So he did. He told her about reading his father's words, about watching Hank Coleman fall in love on paper, about the last letter written 5 days before he died. Jack's voice was low, meant only for Sarah, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, her eyes were wet. He loved you before you existed. That's beautiful and terrible. I spent my whole life angry at a ghost I didn't know was there. You were angry at Tom Mitchell. Maybe? Or maybe I was angry at myself for not being good enough for a man who was never going to love me because I wasn't his son. Sarah reached over and took his hand. The touch was unexpected, almost shocking in its directness. Jack looked down at their joined hands, his weathered and scarred, hers softer but marked by their own history of work and worry. I was angry at you too, Sarah said, for leaving, for choosing silence, for Mom's funeral when you stood there like a statue and wouldn't let anyone in. I didn't know how. I know that now. But I was so mad, Dad. You had this ranch, this perfect excuse to hide, and you just disappeared into it. And I thought, fine, if that's what he wants, if he wants to be alone that badly, I'll let him. Jack squeezed her hand. I'm sorry. I know. That's why I'm here. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, watching the dark ocean pass beneath them. Eventually, Sarah dozed off, her head tilting toward Jack's shoulder. He stayed very still, afraid to move and break whatever fragile thing was being rebuilt between them. He thought about his father, about Hank Coleman pulling a German soldier from a burning tank, about choosing compassion in a moment when hate would have been easier, justified even, about dying for that choice and leaving behind a promise that had taken 79 years to fulfill. What would Hank Coleman think of his son? A tank commander who never commanded in battle, a father who'd failed at connection, a man who'd spent decades running from shadows. Jack didn't know, but he was about to find out. The plane landed in Munich at noon local time. The airport was massive, gleaming, efficient in the way German infrastructure always was. Jack and Sarah cleared customs, collected their bags, and emerged into the arrivals hall where a man in a dark suit held a sign with Jack's name. The driver was professional, courteous, and largely silent. Perfect. He loaded their bags into a Mercedes sedan and navigated them out of the airport complex onto the Autobahn. The German countryside unfolded around them, green and ordered, small villages with church spires, farmland divided into precise parcels. Everything neat, everything controlled. How far? Jack asked. 2 hours to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, the driver said in accented English. The Von Hassel estate is in the mountains. Sarah had her phone out, taking photos of the landscape. It's beautiful here, very different from Texas. Different from everything, Jack murmured. They drove south toward the Alps. The mountains appeared gradually, then dominated, massive and ancient and indifferent to the small human concerns happening in their shadow. The Von Hassel estate was outside a village that looked like something from a postcard. Timber-framed houses, flower boxes, a church with a green copper steeple. The estate itself sat at the end of a private road, surrounded by forest. The house was traditional Bavarian, 3 stories, white stucco with dark timber accents and a steep roof designed for heavy snow. But it was the building behind the house that drew Jack's attention. A massive barn, metal-sided, modern, with large doors and what looked like climate control units. Too industrial for farm equipment, too purposeful for storage. The driver pulled up to the main house and helped with their bags. Before Jack could knock, the front door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing practical clothes and an expression of controlled emotion. She looked at Jack and something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or grief. Mr. Mitchell, she said. Her English was perfect, barely accented. I'm Laura von Hassel Steinberg, Werner's granddaughter. Thank you for coming. Jack shook her offered hand. This is my daughter, Sarah. Laura greeted Sarah warmly, then stepped back to let them enter. The interior of the house was exactly what Jack expected. Old wood, comfortable furniture, photographs covering every available surface. A life fully lived and fully documented. My grandfather is resting, Laura said. He tires easily now. The doctors say weeks, maybe a month. He's been waiting for you, holding on for you, I think. She led them to a sitting room with large windows overlooking the property. Jack could see the barn from here, its presence dominating the view. I need to prepare you, Laura said, settling into a chair across from them. My grandfather is not the man he was, physically, I mean. The cancer has taken a great deal. But his mind is sharp, and he has things he needs to tell you, things he's carried for 79 years. I want to hear them, Jack said. First, I want to show you something. He asked me to do this before you meet him. Context, he says. You need to understand before you see him. She stood and gestured toward the window. The barn, that's his life's work. Would you come with me? They followed her outside across a gravel courtyard to the barn. Laura produced a key and unlocked a side door. Inside, the temperature was controlled, the air dry and slightly cool. Industrial lighting illuminated a space that was part workshop, part museum. And there in the center of the barn were two tanks. On the left, a German Tiger I, massive, angular, painted in late war camouflage. The number 2M14 was visible on the turret. On the right, an American Sherman M4A3E8, smaller, more mobile-looking, wearing the olive drab and white star markings of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, painted on the turret in careful white letters, Iron Promise. Jack stopped breathing. Sarah gasped, "Oh my God." Laura walked forward, her footsteps echoing in the huge space. My grandfather spent 50 years finding these. The Tiger was easier. It was captured, documented, eventually ended up in a scrapyard in Poland. He bought it in 1972 and had it transported here. The restoration took 10 years. She moved to the Sherman. This one was harder. The wreckage was scattered, pieces sold as scrap, components in a dozen different countries. He spent 20 years tracking down every piece, another 15 years rebuilding it. He finished last year. Jack moved closer to Iron Promise. The tank looked exactly like the photograph. The same scarring on the hull, the same arrangement of equipment, the same presence. He reached out and touched the cold metal. His father had commanded this machine, had lived in it, had died defending it. Does it run? His voice was barely a whisper. Both of them do. He insisted. These aren't static displays, they're fully functional. He wanted them to be alive, as close to what they were as possible. Sarah had moved to the Tiger, staring up at its massive gun. This is what your father faced. Yeah. Laura walked between the two tanks, her expression complex. When I was a child, I thought my grandfather was obsessed. Crazy, even. He would spend entire days out here, working on these machines. My grandmother would bring him meals. He'd talk to them like they were alive, like they could hear him. She turned to Jack. Then I got older. I studied history. I learned what happened, what your father did, and I understood these tanks are monuments to the men who died in them, to the choice your father made, to the life that choice gave my grandfather. Jack circled Iron Promise slowly. The details were extraordinary. Every rivet, every weld, every scratch and dent preserved or recreated with obsessive precision. He left notes, Laura continued, inside both tanks, explanations, stories, technical details. He wanted whoever came after him to understand not just the machines, but the men. She opened a hatch on the Sherman and gestured inside. Do you want to see? Jack did. He climbed up onto the hull, his movements stiff but determined, and lowered himself through the commander's hatch. The interior was cramped, exactly as he remembered from his own tank training. But this was different. This was history. This was holy ground. Papers were taped to every surface. Photographs, diagrams, notes in German and English. And there, on the commander's seat, a leather journal. Jack picked it up carefully. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed. He opened to the first entry. April 20th, 1945. I am alive because of an American sergeant named Henry Coleman. He pulled me from my burning tank. He could have left me. He should have left me. We were enemies, but he saw me as a man, not a uniform, and he gave his life for that vision. I do not deserve this second chance, but I will honor it. I will rebuild these machines. I will tell this story. I will make sure the world knows that even in war, even in the worst moments humanity can create, there is still room for compassion. This is my promise to Hank Coleman, to his son, if he exists, to everyone who believes war is inevitable. It is not. But if it comes, let us remember we are all just men in metal boxes, afraid and trying to survive. Jack read entry after entry. Werner Von Hassel had written for decades, documented every step of the restoration. But mostly he'd written about Hank Coleman, about the moment of rescue, about the weight of gratitude, about the life he'd built because of one American's choice. Sarah's voice came from outside the tank. Dad, you okay? Jack climbed out, the journal still in his hands. His face was wet and he didn't care. He spent his whole life honoring my father. A man he knew for maybe 5 minutes. Laura nodded. That's the kind of man your father was. 5 minutes was enough. They stood in silence, the two tanks towering over them, witnesses to a moment that had echoed through 8 decades. Finally, Laura spoke. He wants to meet you. Now, if you're ready. I'm ready. They walked back to the house. Laura led them upstairs to a bedroom that had been converted into a hospital room. Medical equipment beeped softly. An oxygen concentrator hummed. And in the bed, surrounded by pillows and blankets, was Werner Von Hassel. He was tiny. Cancer had consumed him, leaving behind a skeleton wrapped in translucent skin. But his eyes were alert, sharp. They fixed on Jack the moment he entered, and something like wonder crossed his face. You have his eyes. The voice was weak, heavily accented, but clear. I saw them that day. I see them now. Jack approached the bed slowly. Sarah hung back near the door, giving them space. Mr. Von Hassel, I'm Jack Mitchell, Hank Coleman's son. The old man's face crumpled. Tears streamed down his cheeks. I have waited so long. So long. I thought perhaps you did not exist. That he died before you were born. He did. I was born 3 months after. Werner closed his eyes. Then he never held you, never saw you. That is a tragedy. He wrote me letters. Before I was born, I just read them 2 days ago. What did he say? Jack pulled a chair next to the bed and sat. Sarah moved closer, standing behind him with a hand on his shoulder. He said to tell me that tanks are just machines, but the men inside them are brothers, no matter what flag they serve. Werner sobbed. It was a terrible sound, decades of grief released in a moment. Laura moved to comfort him, but he waved her away. That is exactly what he told me. When he pulled me from the Tiger, I was burning, screaming. He grabbed me, and he said, Brother, you're okay. Brother, in the middle of a war, he called me brother. Jack leaned forward. Tell me what happened. All of it. Werner nodded, gathering strength. When he spoke, his voice was stronger, animated by memory. We had been retreating for weeks. The Tiger was almost out of fuel. We had 8 shells left for the main gun. My crew was young. I was 19. The driver, Franz, was 17. We were boys pretending to be soldiers. He paused to catch his breath. Laura adjusted his oxygen. We heard the Sherman before we saw it. American tanks are loud. Not like the Tiger. We moved to intercept. Standard tactics. Find position. Ambush. But when we saw it, when I looked through the scope and saw the commander in the hatch, I saw his face. And I could not shoot. Why? Sarah asked softly. Werner looked at her. Because I was tired. Tired of killing. Tired of war. Tired of following orders from men who were already dead and did not know it. Hitler would be dead in 2 weeks. The war was over. We all knew it. And I looked at that American commander and I thought, if I kill him, what changes? Nothing. The war still ends. Germany still loses. But one more mother loses her son. He coughed, a wet, painful sound. Laura offered water and he sipped carefully. So I did not shoot. And he did not shoot. We moved, positioned, waited. For 40 minutes we danced. 2 tanks, 2 commanders, neither willing to take the final step. Then the artillery came, Jack said. Yes, American. They did not know we were there. Did not know friendly forces were in the area. The first shell hit near the Tiger, started a fire. The second hit your father's Sherman, disabled it. We were both trapped. Werner's breathing was labored now, but he pushed forward. I could not get out. The hatch was jammed. Franz was dead. The others were unconscious or dying. I was burning. I could smell my own skin. And then the hatch opened. From outside, and your father was there. His face, I will never forget. He was afraid. But he reached in and he pulled me out. Werner reached up with a shaking hand and Jack took it. He carried me away from the Tiger, set me down, and then the third shell came. Shrapnel. It hit him. I held him. He was bleeding, dying. And he looked at me and he said, You're going to be okay, brother. You're going to live. Make it mean something. The room was silent except for the medical equipment and Werner's labored breathing. What did you do? Jack asked. I survived. American medics found us. They took me prisoner. I spent 2 years in a POW camp. Then I came home, found my family, rebuilt. I became an engineer, married, had children, built a life. But every day, every single day for 79 years, I have thought about your father, about the choice he made, about the life he gave me. Werner squeezed Jack's hand with surprising strength. I tried to find you for decades. I wrote letters to American military archives. I hired investigators, but your mother remarried. You had a different name. The trail was cold, and then last year the DNA databases. Finally, finally I could keep my promise. What promise? To tell you that your father was a hero, not because he fought, because he chose mercy. That is the hardest courage, to see your enemy as human, to risk everything for that belief. Your father did that, and because of him, I lived. I had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, 12 great-grandchildren, and all of them exist because your father chose life over hate. Werner's eyes were intense, boring into Jack. You carry his face, do you carry his heart? The question hung into the air. Jack thought about his life, the isolation, the silence, the walls he'd built. I don't know, he said honestly. I've spent most of my life alone, pushing people away, being afraid. Of what? Of not being enough, of failing, of being a tank commander who never commanded, a soldier who never fought, a father who couldn't connect. Werner smiled. It was a sad, knowing smile. Your father gave you peace. That is not failure. That is success. You were never supposed to fight. You were supposed to live, to be happy, to pass on something better than war. He looked at Sarah. You have a daughter. That is his legacy. Not tanks, not medals. Life continuing, love continuing. That is what he died for. Laura stepped forward. Grandfather, you should rest. But Werner ignored her. He was focused entirely on Jack. I have one more thing, one final request. Anything. The tanks. Iron Promise and Tiger 214. I want to donate them. To America. To a military museum. But only if you accept. Only if you agree to tell the story. To be the voice for what your father did. To make people understand that even enemies can be brothers. Jack looked at Sarah. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Jack said, I'll do it. Werner exhaled and something left him. Not life, not yet, but tension. Release. The weight of 8 decades lifted. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for coming. Thank you for existing. Thank you for being his son. They sat with him for another hour. Werner drifted in and out of sleep. When he was awake, he told stories. About the Tiger, about his crew, about the moment he first saw Iron Promise and knew his life had changed. Finally, Laura suggested they let him rest. Jack stood, but Werner grabbed his hand one more time. Come back tomorrow. I have more to tell you about the tanks, about the men. Please. I'll be here every day until we leave. Werner smiled. Good, that is good. They left him there, small and frail but somehow more alive than he'd been when they arrived. Downstairs, Laura showed them to guest rooms. The house was large enough to accommodate them comfortably. Jack's room overlooked the barn, and he stood at the window for a long time, watching the light fade, staring at the building that held his father's legacy. Sarah knocked and entered without waiting for permission. She came and stood beside him. That was intense, she said. Yeah. Are you glad we came? Jack turned to look at her, his daughter, 52 years old, half his life estranged, and here now in this moment. Yes, more than I can say. She leaned against him, the way she used to when she was small. Jack put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood like that, father and daughter, watching the German twilight settle over 2 tanks that had carried men to their destinies. Dad? Sarah's voice was quiet. Do you think you're like him? Your father? Jack thought about that. Thought about Hank Coleman pulling a burning man from a tank. Thought about choosing compassion in a moment of chaos. I don't know, but I'd like to try. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay in the guest bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a foreign house in a foreign country, and thought about everything Werner had said. Your father gave you peace. That is not failure. Maybe that was true. Maybe Jack had spent his whole life measuring himself against the wrong standard. Not whether he'd fought, but whether he'd lived. Not whether he'd been fearless, but whether he'd been kind. He thought about Sarah, about the phone call that had brought her here, about her hand in his on the plane, about the way she'd stood behind him while Werner told his story. He thought about Rebecca, dead 8 years now, how she'd loved him despite his silences, how she'd tried to pull him out of himself, how she'd died hoping he'd finally let someone in. He thought about the ranch, the horses, the isolation, the life he'd built as a fortress. And he thought about 2 tanks in a barn, rebuilt by a man who'd spent 50 years honoring a 5-minute choice. At 2 in the morning, Jack got up and dressed. He moved quietly through the house and out to the barn. The door was unlocked. Inside, the tanks waited in the darkness, massive shadows backlit by emergency lighting. Jack climbed up onto Iron Promise again. This time he didn't stop at the commander's hatch. He lowered himself all the way inside, into the commander's position, and sat in the seat his father had occupied 79 years ago. The metal was cold, the space was cramped, but Jack could feel it, the presence of all the men who'd sat here. Hank Coleman, the crews who'd trained in this tank before, the soldiers who'd trusted their commander to bring them home. He sat in the darkness and finally understood. His father hadn't been a hero because he was fearless. He'd been a hero because he'd been afraid and chosen love anyway. That was the promise. That was the legacy. And Jack Mitchell, 78 years old, sitting in his father's seat in a barn in Bavaria, finally knew what he had to do. He had to choose love too. He had to finish what his father started. He had to make it mean something. Dawn came to the Bavarian Alps like a whisper. Jack watched it from the barn, still sitting in Iron Promise's commander seat, as light crept through the high windows and painted the two tanks in shades of gold and shadow. His body ached from the cramped position, but he didn't move. This space, this moment, felt sacred, like a church where the only congregation was ghosts and the only sermon was silence. He heard the barn door open, footsteps on concrete, Sarah's voice, careful and concerned. "Dad, Laura said you weren't in your room." Jack pulled himself up through the commander's hatch, joints protesting, and emerged into the morning light. Sarah stood at the base of the tank, holding 2 cups of coffee, wearing yesterday's clothes and an expression of worried understanding. "I couldn't sleep," he said, climbing down stiffly. She handed him a cup. "So you came out here to sit in a 79-year-old tank? Seemed like the thing to do." They stood together, drinking coffee, looking at the machines that had brought them halfway around the world. "What were you thinking about?" Sarah asked. Jack considered the question. What had he been thinking about? Everything. Nothing. The weight of decades compressed into a single night. "I was thinking that I spent my whole life afraid of being compared to a man I never knew. And now that I know him, I'm more afraid of not living up to him." "You don't have to live up to him, Dad. You just have to live." That's what Werner said. Sarah moved closer to Iron Promise, running her hand along the hull the way Jack had. "It's strange. These are weapons, built to kill. But looking at them now, they feel like something else. Monuments, maybe. Or memories made solid. That's what they are. That's what Werner spent 50 years understanding." The barn door opened again. Laura appeared, and her expression told them everything before she spoke. "He's asking for you. Both of you. He's weaker this morning, but he's determined. He says there are things that must be said." They followed her back to the house, up the stairs to the hospital room. Werner looked smaller than yesterday, if that was possible. The night had taken something from him. His breathing was shallow, labored. The oxygen mask covered his face, but his eyes tracked them as they entered. Laura adjusted the mask so he could speak. "I will keep this brief," Werner said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do not have the strength for long conversations, but there are things you must know, things I must give you." Jack pulled the chair close and sat. Sarah stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. The gesture had become familiar in just 2 days, a connection reestablished. "The tanks," Werner continued, "they are ready to ship. I have made all arrangements, papers, permits, transportation. They will go to Fort Benning, Georgia, the National Armor and Cavalry Museum. I have been in contact with them for 3 years." He paused, gasping for air. Laura adjusted the oxygen flow. "But there is a condition. You must be there when they arrive. When they are unveiled, you must tell the story, my story, your father's story. You must make people understand." "I will," Jack said. "There is more." Werner gestured weakly toward a folder on the bedside table. Laura retrieved it and handed it to Jack. Inside, documents, letters, photographs, everything I have collected about April 15th, 1945, about your father, about my crew, about the men who died that day. It is all yours now, the responsibility, the memory, the promise. Jack opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents, military records, witness statements, photographs of the wreckage, letters from Werner's own crew members, written in the years after the war. And there, at the bottom, a letter addressed to Jack Mitchell in Werner's shaking handwriting. "Read it later," Werner said, "when I am gone. It says things I cannot say now, things about gratitude, about debt, about the weight of being saved when others died. His eyes filled with tears. Your father died so I could live. For 79 years, I have tried to earn that gift, to be worthy of it. I do not know if I succeeded, but I tried. God knows I tried. Sarah spoke, her voice thick with emotion. You built monuments to his memory. You spent your life honoring him. I'd say you succeeded. Werner smiled. You are kind, like your grandfather. Kindness is the rarest courage. They sat with him for an hour. Werner drifted in and out, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused. He spoke in German occasionally, reliving moments from the war. Laura would gently redirect him, bring him back to the present. At one point, he grabbed Jack's hand with surprising strength. Promise me, when they ask about the war, when they want to make it glorious, tell them the truth. War is young men dying for old men's mistakes. Your father understood that. That is why he saved me, not because I deserved saving, but because no one deserves dying or someone else's hatred. I promise. Werner relaxed. Good, that is good. Now I can rest. Laura ushered them out gently. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, exhausted. Thank you for coming. It means everything to him, to all of us. How long? Jack asked. Days, maybe. He's held on this long through sheer will. Now that he's seen you, now that he knows the tanks will go to America with your blessing, he can let go. They spent the rest of that day quietly. Jack and Sarah walked the property, exploring the forest trails, finding peace in the mountain silence. They talked about everything and nothing. Sarah told him about her children, his grandchildren. Emma, 15, was interested in history. Michael, 12, loved mechanics. They both asked about him sometimes, she said. Wondered why Grandpa lived so far away and never visited. I'd like to meet them, Jack said. Really meet them, not just show up at holidays like a stranger. They'd like that too. That evening, they had dinner with Laura and her husband, Georg. The meal was simple but good. Traditional German food served with ceremony. Georg was a quiet man, an engineer like Werner had been, and he spoke about his grandfather-in-law with deep respect. He was the most determined man I ever knew, Georg said. When he set his mind to something, nothing could stop him. Not money problems, not time, not even his own body failing. Those tanks out there, they should not exist. The odds against rebuilding them were impossible. But he did it anyway. Why, Sarah asked. I mean, I know why, in principle. But 50 years of obsession, that's a long time to stay focused on one thing. Georg looked at Laura, who nodded permission for him to speak. Because he had nightmares every night for 79 years. He would wake up screaming, burning, reliving the fire, and the only thing that quieted the dreams was working on the tanks, building them, making them live again. It was therapy in a way, healing through creation. Jack understood that. The need to build something, to fix something, to make order from chaos. He'd spent decades doing the same thing on his ranch. Maybe he and Werner weren't so different. That night, Werner took a turn. Laura called them at midnight. By the time Jack and Sarah reached his room, he was barely conscious. The doctor had increased his morphine. The end was close. They sat with him through the night. Laura held one hand, Jack held the other. Sarah stood behind Jack, her hand on his shoulder. Georg called other family members. By dawn, the room was full. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. 3 generations gathered to witness the passing of a man who had been saved by an enemy and spent his life grateful. Werner opened his eyes one last time as the sun rose. He looked at Jack and smiled. Brother, he whispered, the same word Hank Coleman had used 79 years ago. Then he was gone. The funeral was 3 days later. The entire village attended. Werner Von Hassel had been a fixture in the community for 75 years. He'd employed people, helped rebuild after the war, donated to every cause. The church was packed, standing room only, and the service was conducted in German with whispered translations for Jack and Sarah. But what Jack remembered most was afterward, at the cemetery. Laura asked if he would say something. Jack, who had spent most of his life avoiding speeches and public moments, found himself standing before hundreds of people, searching for words. He looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragement. I didn't know Werner Von Hassel until 3 days before he died, Jack began. His voice was rough but steady. But I've been connected to him my entire life. He was saved by my father, a man I never met, and he spent 79 years trying to repay that debt. He paused, looking at the assembled faces. Germans mostly, but also some Americans who'd flown in, military historians, tank enthusiasts, people who understood the significance. My father pulled him from a burning tank in the middle of a war. He didn't have to. They were enemies. But my father chose to see him as a man, not a uniform. And that choice echoed through nearly 8 decades. It gave Werner a life, a family. Children who had children who had children, all because of one moment of compassion. Jack's voice cracked. Sarah moved closer, standing beside him. Werner asked me to make a promise, to tell people that war is not glorious, that the real courage is choosing mercy when hate is easier, that enemies are just frightened men who could have been brothers under different circumstances. I promised to tell that story, for my father, for Werner, for everyone who never came home. He stepped back. The crowd was silent. Then slowly they began to applaud, not the polite applause of funerals, but something deeper. Recognition, agreement, grief transformed into resolve. After the service, Werner's widow approached Jack. She was 95, small and fragile, but with eyes that had seen everything and survived it. She took Jack's hands in hers. Thank you for coming. Werner waited his whole life for this moment, to meet Hank's son, to know the story would continue. You gave him peace. He gave me something too, Jack said. He gave me my father back, and he showed me what it means to be grateful. She smiled. Werner was many things, stubborn, obsessed, difficult, but grateful, yes, always grateful. He never forgot what your father did, never took a single day for granted. That afternoon, Jack and Laura finalized the arrangements for shipping the tanks. The logistics were complex. Both machines had to be partially disassembled, crated, transported to Hamburg, loaded onto a cargo ship. The cost was enormous, but Werner's estate covered everything. He'd been planning this for years. There's one more thing, Laura said. My grandfather left specific instructions. On the day the tanks are unveiled at Fort Benning, he wanted you to do something. What? Drive Iron Promise. One last mission. He wanted your father's tank to move under its own power, commanded by his son. He said it would complete the circle. Jack felt his throat tighten. I'm 78 years old. I haven't driven a tank in 40 years. The museum has agreed to train you. They'll prep the tank, make sure it's safe. But grandfather was insistent. It has to be you. Sarah spoke up. You can do this, Dad. You have to do this. Jack looked at his daughter, at Laura, at the documents and photographs spread across the table, at the life his father had lived in 23 years and the legacy that had taken 8 decades to fulfill. Okay, he said, I'll do it. They flew home 5 days later. The journey back felt different than the journey there. Jack wasn't running anymore, wasn't hiding. He was carrying something forward, a responsibility that felt heavy and right at the same time. At the Austin airport, Sarah's children were waiting. Emma and Michael, 15 and 12, strangers to Jack but wanting not to be. He saw them through the crowd and felt something crack open in his chest. They looked like Sarah, like Rebecca, like the future he'd been too afraid to embrace. Emma approached first, tentative. Grandpa? Yeah, I'm Grandpa. Mom said you went to Germany, that you found out about your dad. I did. Michael Boulder stepped forward. Was he really a tank commander? Like for real? Jack knelt down, ignoring the protest from his knees. He was, and he was brave and kind, and I'm going to tell you all about him. They drove to Sarah's house in Austin, small, neat, filled with the evidence of lives being lived. School photos, art projects, sports equipment, normal family chaos. Jack had never been inside before. In 10 years of estrangement, he'd never crossed this threshold. Now he did, and it felt like coming home. They stayed up late talking. Jack told stories about Werner, about the tanks, about the letters. Emma listened with intense focus, asking detailed questions. Michael wanted to know about the technical specs, the armor thickness, the gun caliber. Sarah sat back and watched her father connect with her children, and the look on her face was worth every mile Jack had traveled. At midnight, after the kids were in bed, Sarah made tea and they sat in her kitchen. What happens now? She asked. The tanks arrive at Fort Benning in 6 weeks. There's going to be a ceremony, media coverage. I have to give a speech. Drive Iron Promise in a demonstration. Are you scared? Terrified. Good. That means it matters. Jack smiled. When did you get so wise? I had a good mother and a father who's finally figuring it out. The 6 weeks passed in a blur. Jack returned to the ranch, but it felt different now. Less like a fortress, more like a home he could leave and return to. He made arrangements for the horses, hired a part-time ranch hand to help with maintenance. He couldn't hide here anymore. There was work to do. Sarah visited twice, bringing Emma and Michael. They helped with chores, learned about horses, sat with Jack on the porch, and listened to stories. Michael was fascinated by engines, so Jack taught him about the tractor, let him help with repairs. Emma asked questions about the war, about history, about what it meant to be brave when you were afraid. Jack also called David Brennan. They spoke for hours about Hank Coleman, about the men who'd served with him. Brennan shipped Jack more materials from his father's collection: photographs, letters, recordings of interviews Robert Brennan had conducted in the years after the war. Jack absorbed it all, built a picture of his father that was complex and real. Hank Coleman had been young and scared and determined. He'd made mistakes, lost men under his command, carried guilt. But he'd also been kind, fair, willing to see humanity in everyone, even enemies. The more Jack learned, the more he realized he and his father weren't so different. Both had been tank commanders. Both had been afraid. The only difference was circumstance. Hank had been tested by war. Jack had been tested by peace. Neither test was easier. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Jack started training. The museum sent an instructor to the ranch, a retired Army sergeant named Marcus Crawford, who'd spent 20 years with armor units. He brought manuals, videos, technical specifications. "The Sherman is a beast," Crawford said. "Reliable but temperamental. You'll need to relearn everything." They practiced on simulators first. Then Crawford arranged for Jack to train on a restored Sherman at Fort Hood. The muscle memory came back slowly: controls, coordination, the particular rhythm of commanding a tank. Jack's body protested. He was 78, not 20. But he pushed through, driven by something deeper than physical limitation. This was his father's tank. This was his father's legacy. He would not fail. Sarah came to watch him train. She stood on the range at Fort Hood and watched her father command Iron Promise through its paces, and she cried. Not from sadness, but from pride. Her father, who'd been broken and distant her whole life, was finally whole. The night before the ceremony, Jack couldn't sleep. He was in a hotel near Fort Benning, and the weight of the next day pressed on him like physical force. At 3 in the morning, he gave up and drove to the museum. Security let him in. Everyone knew who he was by now. The story had spread. The tanks were already positioned in the main exhibition hall. Tiger 214 and Iron Promise, side by side under dramatic lighting. A crowd of over 5,000 was expected. Senators would attend, generals, media from around the world. The story of the tanks, of Werner and Hank, had captured imaginations. Jack walked between the machines, trailing his fingers along their hulls. Tomorrow he would tell their story. Tomorrow he would complete the promise. He climbed into Iron Promise one last time alone, sat in the commander's seat, closed his eyes, and tried to feel his father's presence. "I don't know if you can hear me," Jack said to the darkness, "but I'm here, your son. I'm 78 years old and I never knew you, but I'm trying to understand. You saved a life because you believed mercy was stronger than hate. You died for that belief. And 80 years later, that one choice is still echoing." His voice broke. "I spent my life afraid I wasn't good enough, afraid I wasn't brave like you. But Werner taught me something. You didn't save him because you were fearless. You saved him because you were afraid and chose love anyway. That's the real courage. And I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying to do the same." He sat in silence for a long time. Then he heard footsteps. Sarah appeared, climbing up to join him. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Too much in my head." She settled next to him in the cramped space. "This is surreal, sitting in a tank with my dad the night before he drives it in front of thousands of people. Your grandfather sat here first, 79 years ago, commanded this machine through hell, and I'm just trying to drive it across a parade ground. You're doing more than that, Dad. You're keeping a promise. That's harder than any battle." The ceremony began at 10. The exhibition hall was packed beyond capacity. Jack stood backstage wearing his dress uniform for the first time in 30 years. Sarah was in the front row with Emma and Michael. Laura had flown in from Germany with her family. David Brennan was there, Marcus Crawford, fellow veterans, strangers who'd been moved by the story. The museum director gave opening remarks. A general spoke about the significance of the tanks. Then it was Jack's turn. He walked to the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and felt his father standing beside him. My name is Jack Mitchell, he began. I'm the son of Staff Sergeant Henry Coleman, 3rd Armored Division, killed in action April 17th, 1945. I never met my father. He died before I was born. But 3 months ago, I met the man he saved, and that meeting changed everything. He told the story, all of it. The DNA revelation, the journey to Germany, meeting Werner, the barn with its monuments. The promise made and kept across 8 decades. These tanks behind me are not weapons anymore. They're testaments to the moment when one man chose compassion over hate, to the 79 years of gratitude that followed, to the belief that enemies are just people who haven't been given the chance to be brothers. His voice was steady now, strong. My father died young. He never got to see me grow up, never held his son, never knew if his sacrifice meant anything. But it did. It gave Werner Von Hassel a life, a family, generations. And it gave me a legacy I'm only now beginning to understand. Jack paused, looking directly at the tanks. War is terrible. War is waste. But even in war, there is room for mercy, for seeing the humanity in those we're taught to hate. My father understood that. Werner understood that. And I promise to spend whatever time I have left making sure their story is not forgotten. The applause was thunderous. Jack stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed. The general approached and shook his hand. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Crawford appeared with the crew, 4 volunteers who trained to operate Iron Promise. But Jack would command. It was his right, his responsibility, his father's seat. They climbed aboard. The engine started with a roar that filled the hall. Exhaust, noise, the smell of diesel and hot metal. Jack settled into the commander's position, put on the headset, and gave the order. Driver, move out! Iron Promise lurched forward. The crowd gasped as the Sherman rolled across the exhibition hall floor, tracks clanking, engine growling. Jack stood in the commander's hatch, one hand on the turret, exactly as his father had stood 79 years ago. The tank completed a circuit of the hall, then stopped precisely at its designated position. Jack climbed out to another wave of applause. He was shaking, exhausted, exhilarated. Sarah rushed to him, threw her arms around him. You did it, Dad. You actually did it. We did it. You, me, Werner, my father, all of us. The ceremony continued for another hour. More speeches, tank demonstrations. But Jack barely heard it. He stood with Sarah and his grandchildren, with Laura and her family, with David Brennan, who represented his father's crew. They were all witnesses to a promise kept. That evening, as the crowds dispersed and the exhibition hall emptied, Jack stood alone one final time between the 2 tanks. The museum would care for them now. They would stand here, side by side, telling their story to generations who needed to hear it. Jack pulled out the letter Werner had written, the one he'd been told to read after Werner's death. He'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Now in the quiet of the museum, he opened it. The handwriting was shaky but clear. Dear Jack, if you are writing this, I am gone. Good, I have waited long enough. 79 years is a long time to carry gratitude. Your father gave me everything. My life, my family, my future. I spent decades trying to repay that debt. But debts like that cannot be repaid. They can only be honored. I rebuilt these tanks not because I love war. I hate war. War took my friends, my youth, my innocence. But I rebuilt them because they represent the moment when war failed. When 2 men stood in metal boxes with every reason to kill each other and chose not to. When mercy proved stronger than orders. You carry your father's face. I saw it the moment you walked into my room. But more importantly, you carry his capacity for change. You came to me broken, isolated, afraid. You left with your daughter beside you. That transformation, that willingness to open your heart even when it terrifies you, that is your father's true legacy. The tanks will stand in the museum. People will come to see them, to marvel at the machinery, to hear the story. But the real monument is you, living, loving, choosing connection over isolation. That is what your father died for. Not tanks, not victory, but the chance for his son to live in peace. I have one final request. Go back to your ranch, but do not hide there. Make it a place where broken veterans can come and heal, where men who have seen too much can find silence that soothes instead of silence that isolates. Build a community, share what you have learned. Let your father's sacrifice ripple forward. Thank you for coming to Germany. Thank you for sitting with me. Thank you for keeping the promise. You are your father's son. Be proud of that. With eternal gratitude, Werner von Hassel, Jack folded the letter carefully. Around him, the museum settled into nighttime quiet. The tank stood silent, monuments to a moment that refused to fade. He thought about Werner's request, the ranch, a place for healing. He could do that. He wanted to do that. Jack pulled out his phone and called Sarah. Hey, Dad, everything okay? Yeah, better than okay. I have an idea. Can you come back to the ranch this weekend? Bring Emma and Michael. I want to talk about starting something. A foundation, maybe. A place where veterans can come and find peace. Dad, that's amazing. Of course I'll come. We all will. They talked for a few more minutes, making plans. When Jack hung up, he felt lighter than he had in decades. He took one last look at Iron Promise, his father's tank, his father's legacy, his father's choice. I'll finish it, Jack said quietly. I promise. Then he walked out of the museum into the Georgia night. The air was warm, thick with humidity and the sound of crickets. Stars blazed overhead, the same stars that had shone on a battlefield in Germany 79 years ago. Jack Mitchell, 78 years old, son of a hero he'd never met, climbed into his rental car and drove toward tomorrow, toward his daughter, toward his grandchildren, toward a ranch that would become a refuge, toward a life finally lived in the light instead of shadows. The promise had been kept, and now finally he could rest. But not alone, never alone again.